One man came to hold most of the matches in the world, and with that money, he lent enormous sums to the governments of one country after another. Kings and presidents hailed him as the savior who had rescued their nations. France pinned its highest honor on him, and the American president invited him to the White House. Shares in his company were considered the safest investment on earth. Then, one day in 1932, he was found dead in a Paris apartment, shot through the chest. Only after his death did the shocking truth come out. One of the richest and most respected men in the world had in fact been one of the greatest fraudsters in history. That glittering empire had been built on nothing but an enormous lie. He had even forged a nation's government bonds with his own hands. His name was Ivar Kreuger of Sweden, the man they called the Match King. And astonishingly, the securities regulators and the accounting rules that protect us today were born out of this man's fraud. Let us step inside this extraordinary rise and fall that began with a single matchstick. Let me introduce our main character. Ivar Kreuger was born in 1880, the son of a family that owned a small match factory in Sweden. He was a trained engineer, and at the same time, he had a natural gift for handling money. After building a career in construction in America, he returned home and took over the family match business. He was, in fact, a highly capable engineer who had made his name in America with a new building technique. But why matches of all things? Lighters have pushed them aside today, but back then matches were a daily necessity in every household on Earth. To light a fire or a lamp, you simply had to have matches. They were cheap, but the whole of humanity burned through them every single day, and that made the market enormous. Kreuger saw a vast opportunity in it. He merged the Swedish match companies into one, and soon reached out beyond his own borders. The company that emerged, Swedish Match, would end up with factories in 36 countries. At its peak, more than half of all the matches in the world were made by his hands. A single little matchstick had grown one man into a global titan. But what truly turned Kreuger into a legend was not the matches themselves. It was the astonishing business method he invented. The time was the 1920s, just after the First World War, and the treasuries of Europe had been emptied by the fighting. To governments desperate for cash, Kreuger made a very tempting offer. "We will lend you an enormous sum," he said, "and in return you give us the exclusive right to sell matches in your country." Here we need to pause on the idea of a monopoly. A monopoly means one company holding the sole right to sell a particular product. With no competitors, it can set whatever price it likes and keep every bit of the profit. The government got the cash it desperately needed, and Kreuger swallowed that country's entire match market. In this way, the money he lent to governments around the world came to more than $300 million. In exchange, he seized the match monopoly in 16 countries. After lending $75 million to France, he was even awarded that country's highest decoration. Germany, Poland, and a string of nations in South America all took his money and handed over their match monopolies. The benefactor who lent money and rescued nations. That was the face of Kreuger the world knew. By now, Kreuger needed a staggering amount of money. To keep lending to one government after another, he had to pull in capital on the same scale. So he held out his hand to investors all over the world, and above all to Americans. Shares and bonds in his holding company, Kreuger and Toll, were sold on a massive scale on Wall Street. The reaction from investors was nothing short of explosive. Year after year, Kreuger handed out dividends so generous they were hard to believe. A dividend is the money a company pays out to its shareholders from the profits it has earned. His dividends, running close to 20%, were a dream return for the time. People believed that Kreuger stock was the safest and surest investment in the world. Widows and pensioners handed over their entire life savings to his company. His fame went through the roof. He appeared on the cover of Time magazine, and even served as an advisor to President Hoover of the United States. He was trusted by the King of Sweden and treated as a national treasure. Kreuger the Match King had become, quite literally, the emperor of world finance. But here a fundamental question arises. Matches are a cheap product, so how could he keep paying out such staggering dividends? Right here lies the secret that made his collapse inevitable. The truth is that Kreuger was not paying dividends out of the profits his company earned. He was taking the money of new investors and handing it to the older ones, calling it a dividend. This is the structure of the famous Ponzi scheme. A Ponzi scheme means using the money of the people at the back to pay a return to the people at the front. As long as new money keeps flowing in, nothing looks wrong at all. But the moment the flow of money stops, everything collapses at once. Kreuger hid this dangerous truth behind a set of cunningly cooked books. He set up hundreds of shell companies in tax havens and pushed his losses out of the ledger, hiding a company's debts where the books cannot show them has a name, off-balance sheet accounting. The books on the surface always looked magnificent, but behind them there was nothing but an empty shell. On top of that, he never showed the company's real books to a single soul. Even the directors of his own company had no idea what state it was actually in. Even this seemingly perfect shuffle eventually ran into its limit. In 1929, the Great Depression swept across the world. Share prices crashed, and the flow of new money from investors dried up completely. The structure that used the money at the back to cover the front began to shake at its very foundations. Even so, Kreuger struggled desperately to keep up the magnificent appearance. And then he crossed a final line from which there was no coming back. To make it look as though he had the funds, he forged $100 million worth of Italian government bonds with his own hands. A private man manufacturing a sovereign nation's bonds himself. It was a crime almost impossible to imagine. As was later revealed, a large share of the assets written into his books were fictions like this one. He was propping up an enormous empire with money that did not exist. The banks slowly began to suspect his company and pressed him to show them the real books. Demands to pay the money back poured in from every direction. He went from one American bank to another trying to raise cash in a hurry, but the situation was already beyond saving. The match empire the world had looked up to was quietly collapsing from the inside. On the 12th of March, 1932, a gunshot rang out in an expensive Paris apartment. On the morning of a crucial meeting with the banks, Kreuger was found dead, shot through the chest. The police concluded that he had taken his own life. On the desk lay a short note left behind for those closest to him. It looked like the miserable end of a cornered match king. But years later, his own brother insisted that he had been murdered. What the truth really is remains a mystery to this day. When news of his death broke, financial markets around the world fell into panic. Shares in Kreuger's company, trading at $8, crashed to 50 cents in an instant. The investment they had called the safest in the world became worthless paper overnight. The debts his company left behind came to $1.2 billion, the largest bankruptcy in history at the time. Countless people who had entrusted him with everything they owned were left on the street without a penny. One man's lie had swallowed the lives of hundreds of thousands of people around the world. After his death, the accounting firm Price Waterhouse began digging through his empire. Sifting the books of more than 400 companies took them 5 years, and the conclusion they reached was shocking. His accounting tricks, they said, were so crude that even a child could have spotted them. The world had failed to notice such a clumsy lie for decades. How on earth was that possible? Because at the time there were no unified rules and no watchdog capable of properly checking a company's books. It was this painful episode that brought about an enormous change. Spurred by the Kreuger affair, America passed the Securities Act of 1933 and created its market watchdog, the Securities and Exchange Commission. The system in which every listed company today discloses its books transparently and submits to an outside audit begins right here. So how, then, should we judge Kreuger? There are two opposing views. Some call him the most cunning swindler in history, but others say he was a brilliant businessman and innovator who built a real match empire. After all, the dual-class share structure he devised is still in use today. The off-balance sheet trick he invented even came back to life in the frauds of giant corporations like Enron. In the end, the lesson the Match King left us is clear. However dazzling the reputation and however high the returns, if they are not transparently verified, they can turn out to be an enormous lie at any moment. If you want to dig into fascinating economic stories like this from around the world with us every week, subscribe and come along.